Having to translate between languages in your own head is one of the most common problems language learners encounter. It makes having a conversation almost impossible. And if you're learning the way that most people do, then you're almost certainly going to encounter this problem yourself. But the good news is that it can actually almost be completely avoided once you understand what causes it and how to fix the issue. So in this video, I'll be giving you the mindset shift and change in approach that helped me going from always being stuck in my head, never being able to stop translating, to never having this problem again. So if you want to learn exactly how to start thinking in a new language, stop translating in your head, and the exact reason behind why you had this problem in the first place, then stick around. So the first thing you need to understand to fix your little translation problem is where it comes from in the first place. And I believe all this ultimately boils down to is having done too little of the right practices. Let me explain. So for me, out of the 4 languages I speak, the only language I've ever had this problem with was Spanish. And when I look back to my approach, I realized it was quite different from the rest. For English and Swedish, all I ever did was listen to stuff and learn things that way. Never did I try to understand the grammar or explicitly learn new words. And for Japanese, my approach was pretty similar, although with a little bit more learning involved. The key here, however, is that my approach to all these languages were heavily listening focused, instead of me trying to learn words and use them before my brain was ready to do so. And this is the exact mistake I made in Spanish, which is also how most people learn, and subsequently why they'll have to deal with this problem pretty much forever. Now, if you take a critical look at your approach to language learning, I can almost guarantee you that it looks more like trying to pass an exam than to actually learn a language. And here's where we get to one of the most important concepts to understand for language learning, which is that language isn't math. You don't have to explicitly learn and understand the exact meanings and usages of words. You really just have to use maybe a little bit of explicit learning and then let your brain do the rest for you, learning approximately when and how words are used. And if you do that, then you have no problems using them correctly. Now, how this lack of understanding manifests itself in people's learning is that they tend to mainly, or perhaps exclusively, learn words without context. They'll look up translations and try to remember them explicitly, as well as try to memorize the complexities of grammar to use it mid-conversation. But if you actually think about it, why would an approach that's translating things between different languages and actively trying to understand and memorize grammar rules result in the outcome of you being able to use the language with little to no thinking at all? Well, the short answer is that it doesn't. You can't just go from translating stuff every time you want to learn something to then being able to use the language seamlessly without thinking, just like a native would. So the basic solution to this is to do enough things that promote translation-free fluency to the point where your brain thinks you consumed enough of the language to justify allowing you to use it in that way. And exactly how to do that is what I'm going to teach you now. The first step of overcoming this problem is to think and act in the way that people who never have this problem act, which is to think that you're already a speaker of the language instead of a learner. So how would a speaker of, let's say, English use it in their daily lives? Well, they'd probably watch videos like this, TV shows, movies, maybe read books and hear around them in school and work, etc. They learn the language from pure context, which is objectively the optimal way to learn if you want to avoid translating at all, since you literally don't even know the translations of the words you're using. But this is obviously extremely time intensive and impractical, so therefore you still want to take advantage of some explicit learning, but just not letting it become the main focus of your learning. I mean, you still regularly learn new vocabulary in your native language, but the reason for why you can use it without thinking is because of how you learn it. You primarily learn through hearing words being repeated over and over again in different contexts, until you can finally understand it good enough to understand it without thinking, and then after a while, maybe you yourself start using it as well. Now, if you see a word you don't quite understand, you may pause the thing you're watching to look it up and see what it means, or maybe ask someone around you who perhaps knows. But never have I seen a native speaker look up a word and dwell on the meaning of it for 30 minutes to an hour trying to understand exactly how it's used. That just doesn't really happen. I mean, I've never looked up what the word dwell actually means, yet I used it just now. And that's because I've heard it probably hundreds or maybe even thousands of times before in a similar context to this, so I instinctively know exactly how to use it. Now, the reason this approach is better is because by consuming a lot of the language and getting a lot of it into your head, you'll get more opportunities to hear the word used in slightly different contexts, which will give you a better overall understanding of it, rather than do what most people do, which is independently learn words without the proper context accompanying it. Now, if you think about it, you can probably say basic words and phrases in your target language without thinking at all, such as hello or thank you or whatever. But when it comes to more complicated stuff, you really can't use it without thinking, even if you can look at the word and tell me what it means. And this is simply because you haven't naturally come across it enough, meaning that your understanding of it is very limited. So your problem isn't not knowing stuff. It's rather how you've learned it and how often you come across it in different contexts. So how would you actually use this and start applying it to your own learning then? Well, it's quite simple. Like I said, you just have to think of yourself like you already speak the language. This means that you can't wait until you're quote unquote ready to start doing things like watching YouTube videos, TV shows or movies in the language. You have to do it even if you don't think you're ready. Now, you might tell me that you're not ready yet or you don't know enough to do that. But the thing is that you won't ever feel ready before you've actually done the things enough. Now, here's something very important as well. Even if you have to constantly think about what stuff means in English, you really don't want to let that disturb your learning. Just simply keep watching and try to just subconsciously understand stuff. You might be skipping over a bunch of things, having to think in your head, and then it goes on to the next word, you have to think about that too. But just keep going, because with time, if you do that enough, your brain is gonna get used to not having to think while watching stuff. It might sound pretty weird in the beginning, and trust me, I thought it was very weird as well, because like I said, I had this exact same problem with Spanish. But the more I watched, the more I got used to not thinking, and after a while, I was able to understand more and more stuff without thinking as well, which is a really nice feeling. So just keep going, even if you can't understand everything, and with time, trust me, you will understand more and more. With this being said, however, you want to spend maybe 75% of your time doing stuff like this, and listening to the language. But that also means you want to spend about 25% of your time actively learning new vocabulary and grammar as well, explicitly, even though I said that wasn't the best idea before. But the important thing here is how you do it. So let's start by going over how to learn vocabulary properly. Most people learn via apps or textbooks, trying to memorize different translations until the time comes when they want to use it in a real conversation. But this is like wanting to join the UFC, and instead of actually training MMA, which is the sport you want to participate in, you train a bunch of different martial arts. Now, will you make some progress doing this? Of course. But using them together will always feel unnatural unless you practice doing that. So why not just practice the thing you want to do instead? The problem with doing each thing separately is that you'll be used to using the words in a context where all you have to focus on is the word itself. It's like wrestling someone who can't punch you and then expecting to be able to wrestle in the exact same way with someone who is allowed to punch you. It's not gonna be the same thing. So going back to language learning, this approach lacks context. And because you're just learning stuff via translations and not how it's actually used in the language, when it comes to speaking, you have to think of what to say, what is called in English, and then the correct translation into the language you want to speak in. And I mean, this is obviously impractical on so many levels. And on top of this, it can actually be flat out wrong a lot of times, simply because of the way that different languages express different ideas differently. Such as in English, we obviously say I'm hungry. In Spanish, we say I have hunger, and in Japanese, we say my stomach is empty. So these are very different ways of expressing the same thing, which means that if all you do is learn these words separately and then trying to come up with your own sentence, it's quite likely to be wrong in a lot of cases. So the solution to this is look at vocabulary like you're just trying to create a mental dictionary entry. You look at a word and you try to understand its meaning briefly, but then you move on without thinking too hard on it. Now, what I mean by mental dictionary is building this little collection of word meanings in your head that gives your future self the best chance to recognize these words within context at a later stage. Doing this means that the next time you hear this word in a TV show or YouTube video, you may recognize it from your vocabulary study. But at the same time, you haven't spent too much time independently learning the word, which means that you've made sure that you've associated the word with its English translation as little as possible. And this will optimize the time you spend on each kind of learning for the best possible results. But vocabulary is, however, not the only thing people study incorrectly. Which brings us on to the topic of grammar. One of the things that tend to annoy people the most about learning languages is the grammar. You often hear complaints about the word order being different or verb conjugations being so difficult to remember. But that's assuming that you even have to remember them in the first place. The only reason you feel like you have to even remember grammar is because you haven't heard enough of the language used properly to have it feel natural to you. Now, people will talk about stuff like word order being so different in languages like Japanese. But honestly, in my years studying, I've never thought about it. Yet I would struggle to speak with the wrong word order. This is because I've heard Japanese people speak the language correctly so many times that my brain intuitively knows what's correct or not. And we all know this with languages that we speak well. Now, of course, unless you're completely fluent, you will still make grammar mistakes. But this whole thing about having to remember and totally memorize every grammar rule is something I've never had to bother with in any of my languages, other than Spanish like I mentioned before, which is because I used this wrongful method to learn it in the first place. Now, grammar can be useful in the beginning stages to speed up the amount of time it takes to learn. But if you rely on your conscious understanding of grammar for too long, then understanding and constructing natural speech will always feel unnatural. Because you never actually get a good feel for the grammar by hearing it used naturally in different situations, which will also mean that you always have to operate from your conscious knowledge of the language, which will make using the language very unnatural and have you always producing unnatural speech. So what I recommend you do is to study some grammar in the beginning, but then just learn the rest along the way. If you, for example, keep hearing a certain verb ending while watching a TV show or something, then just pause, look it up, get a basic understanding, and then resume and keep watching. Don't do this every time you can't understand something, give it a few times first, but if you can't understand it after a while from pure context, then do look up a quick meaning, but make sure to keep watching afterwards. This will teach you how it's used naturally, and because you also kept watching afterwards, you maybe heard it a few more times in the same sentence or same conversation, and because of that, it got further cemented into your head. Doing it this way will make it so that you're not reliant on translations or having to think about stuff, since you learned it pretty naturally. Yes, you looked up the meaning of it, but you heard it used in the context of where it's supposed to be used in a natural piece of media, preferably by a native speaker multiple times. So you're not just learning the thing, but you're actually hearing the whole conversation and the words around it as well, which will make it so that when you want to use it, you have an idea how native speakers also use it. Now, following the tips in this video will make it so that you're now spending less time on vocabulary and grammar study, and instead more time actually listening to the language that you want to learn. This means you're now going to be acquiring the language in a natural way, without too many translations, which will make translating in your head almost impossible, and you'll soon be able to start thinking in your target language without a problem. But for the best possible results, I recommend you watch my full guide on comprehensible input and how to properly learn a language in a natural way. So I'll see you guys there.